they know that there is a window or a door to get out of it. And she said it all had to do with image. And she was very athletic, she worked out and so on, so she looked gorgeous.
So hi, and I wanted to ask if you can introduce yourself a little bit, just so people know your interests and what you do.
Yes, of course. Yeah, happy to do that. I'm dual national British and American, lived in London for years. I've had 11 books published on both sides of the Atlantic. So I started off my career as a journalist and later trained as a teacher of Asian medicine. So I have dual careers. And I've lived all over the world, Africa, Europe, the United Kingdom and the USA. So I'm very much of a globetrotter and of course, very much of an activist feminist and very active in the field of health activism as well. So that just about sums it up.
So as you know, my subject area is kind of researching the romanticization of certain aesthetics that are toxic to young girls and just young audience in general, specifically focusing on Hollywood films. And I delve into topics like inappropriate age gap relationships and self-image problems girls deal with, and also a specific example about how death is only seen when it's usually a beautiful woman, and that's only when it grabs people's attention. So I wanted to ask, looking into some of these examples in Hollywood and media, what kind of twisted entertainment do you think the audience get from seeing these images being played out on screen?
Of course, it's, I think, very destructive, especially to young teenage girls and teenage boys as well, to get the mixed messages that frequently come through, not just Hollywood, but I also blame social media as well, which has a profound impact in the way people see themselves and have their image and so on. But I date a lot of this kind of glamorization and also sadism involved in death imagery that comes through. And I refer back to one of the lead.
So, and I wanted to ask if you can introduce yourself a little bit, just so people know your interests and what you do.
Yes, of course. Yeah, happy to do that. I'm dual national British and American, lived in London for years. I've had 11 books published on both sides of the Atlantic. So I started off my career as a journalist and later trained as a teacher of Asian medicine. So I have dual careers. And I've lived all over the world, Africa, Europe, the United Kingdom and the USA. So I'm very much of a globetrotter and of course, very much of an activist feminist and very active in the field of health activism as well. So that just about sums it up.
So as you know, my subject area is kind of researching the romanticization of certain aesthetics that are toxic to young girls and just young audience in general, specifically focusing on Hollywood films. And I delve into topics like inappropriate age gap relationships and self-image problems girls deal with, and also a specific example about how death is only seen when it's usually a beautiful woman, and that's only when it grabs people's attention. So I wanted to ask, looking into some of these examples in Hollywood and media, what kind of twisted entertainment do you think the audience get from seeing these images being played out on screen?
Of course, it's, I think, very destructive, especially to young teenage girls and teenage boys as well, to get the mixed messages that frequently come through, not just Hollywood, but I also blame social media as well, which has a profound impact in the way people see themselves and have their image and so on. But I date a lot of this kind of glamorization and also sadism involved in death imagery that comes through. And I refer back to one of the leading feminist, Kate Millett's articles on Marilyn Monroe that appeared in the 90s during an exhibit on Marilyn Monroe, where she actually mentioned the fact that the media went crazy about the fact that Marilyn Monroe was found dead and naked. And how this was so exploitive. And it also kind of mirrored the exploitation of the kind of blonde bimbo image that was given to Marilyn Monroe, which never took into consideration her brilliance as a comedian and also as an intellectual as well. None of that ever came through. So, you know, you can date this back a couple of decades. And currently, what I always emphasize to people is, yes, there's an insatiable demand worldwide for what they call snuff flicks, which are absolutely disgusting. And there were horrific murders of young women factory workers over the Texas-Mexico border in Juarez in the killing fields up until, I don't know, but during the last 20, 15 years. And all of that apparently fed a snuff flicks frenzy around the world, which is ghastly. I met the mother of one of those young women who was on a quest to try and find the perpetrators. So what I did, I sort of, to honor them and to memorialize them in my latest book, Crossing Lines, I in fact, I dedicated it to the memories of these young women and actually depicted one such horrific murder, simply to, as a warning to people and as also a warning to young women to be very vigilant about their surroundings and to be very conscious of the fact that they don't need to buy into the media image of what they should or should not be. There's so many mixed messages and so many fragmented messages going on here. My advice always to the young daughters of dear friends of mine is to build up something that is very solid in their own lives and very personal to them. And to build up the imagery from inside, not to do it through makeup and clothes and so on, not to feel that they have to obey some kind of fashionable norm or whatever comes through social media. And I'm particularly conscious of the cyberbullying that goes on, that puts huge pressure on a lot of young women and also on young men as well, to be a certain image or something. And I think to develop a uniqueness is the key here, and also to go into the martial arts if the bullying continues, because nobody will bully somebody who's accomplished in the martial arts, whether they're male or female. So I know I've given you a huge response to your question. Did I leave out any gaps, actually?
No, I think it's great. I do agree that it's really important for young girls to just find these good examples that they can look into, because as you said, social media these days is really harmful and really showing a bad image that these girls are following. One of the images that I found online is how Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita is being really romanticized by young women, showing those age-gap relationships as a really romantic way and like how it's supposed to be normal, and when it's really inappropriate and quite grotesque. What do you think on that romanticization?
Well, the appalling part about it actually is that Lolita has entered our language as being an obsession of an older male with a young, oh my goodness, I mean, Lolita was what, 14 or 15 or something. Absolutely horrifying. And the trouble is that Nabokov, of course, is an accomplished and wonderful writer, so people kind of revere and honor him, but at the same time are appalled by the Lolita image. And unfortunately, it does recur a lot. It recurs a lot, as you've mentioned, in a lot of Hollywood movies as well. The flip side of this, and I keep wanting to kind of balance the sort of horror of the Lolita image with the very strong imagery that comes through actors like Nicole Kidman, Kate Winslet, Kate Blanchett, Melissa McCarthy, Charlize Theron, and these really gutsy, Meryl Streep, of course, some of whom are getting older and are not afraid to show their gray hair or to show their wrinkles and so on. You find in British-made movies a lot more honoring of older women actors and the wrinkles and the gray hair like me than you do in a lot of American movies, where there's many attempts to sort of youthify and glamorize. But a lot of these very gutsy women actors are sort of bucking that trend as well. So it's important to see the kind of balance and the balancing in the imagery that is being done by media personalities and also by great actors who are very vociferous and outspoken about this. But it is pretty horrifying. And the trouble, again, and I get back to social media, I'm deeply disturbed by these, chat rooms where people pose as teenagers, and they're these dreadful pedophile older men, and going out there trying to sort of attract young men and young women, and they meet in parking lots or whatever. And I feel very, very so disturbed by this and saddened, and it puts a huge pressure on parents to check the social media and the chat rooms that their kids are getting into, because often they don't know. They're the last people to know.
Yeah.
And murders have occurred, kidnappings and so on. And a lot of it does have to do with that image and slick talkers as well. And this is something that's very contemporary as well. I don't think 15 years ago it was as prevalent as it is now, or even 10 years ago. But it puts huge pressure on kids. And then they're on Facebook chatting with their friends about it and so on. And that kind of augments the problem. And I always say, build up something internally. It doesn't matter if it's sport, photography, art, dance, gardening, acrobatics, skateboarding, skiing, or whatever. Something that is absolutely and totally theirs, that they can control and develop and maximize and perfect. Because that gives that kind of courage as a nice counterbalance to all the media pressures about image and how that you shouldn't look, and the correct size and the not correct size and so on. So they have to balance the enormous pressures that are coming through social media and also through the movies as well, and see really constructive movies. Don't get sucked into the Lolita image, which is very damaging and very destructive. And if you read the novel, and it's worthwhile reading it again, the terrible impact it had on Lolita's life. I mean, it damaged her for life.
Trauma.
And that's the sad part about it, actually, the tremendous damaging effect. Then you get into bulimia, anorexia, and also cutting. And I think we all know girls that have been through that, and some boys as well. And that's deeply disturbing, because that's a lifetime to get over those particular habits, an absolute lifetime. In fact, I saw a young woman demonstrating, I can't remember when it was, and I looked at her arms and I said, "Oh my goodness, were you in a fire?" And she said, "No." She said, "As a teenager, I did a lot of cutting." And I said, "Well, I admire," she was wearing a t-shirt or something, it was summertime. I said, "I really admire you." And she said, "This is a way of demonstrating to other young teenage girls the dangers of cutting." She said, "I want them to come and talk to me and to talk about it and ask me about them." So I commended her. I said, not only is this immensely brave, but if they hear it from you, it makes a lot more sense than if they hear it from a teacher or a parent or a school counselor or something, because you can talk eye to eye with them. And you said, "That's exactly why I bare my arms in public places." And I thought, yeah, go for it. And I think she was only 19 or 20. I mean, it wasn't many years before that she was involved in cutting. And I said, also tell them how you got out of the cutting habit, because I think that's equally important, that they know that there is a window or a door to get out of it. And she said it all had to do with image. And she was very athletic, she worked out and so on. So she looked gorgeous, and that was also a very good message going across to young women as well, is build up your own inner self-confidence by building yourself physically and emotionally to get over the cutting habit. She said she was anorectic and cutting. Pretty frightening. Not uncommon.
Yeah, it is very frightening how common it is. And I feel like,
right.
As you said, it's really important I feel like young girls or kids just get embarrassed a lot by these issues, and they don't want to talk about it and get shut out, since it doesn't age like that, where you think you know everything. So I think speaking
Absolutely.
to a survivor who is close to age and knows exactly how to go through these mental issues, it's important.
Very important. Very important that young people who've been through it come out and talk about it, and start counseling, or going into schools and talking to the kids about it. Because that message gets across very much so, rather than coming from an older teacher or something.
Yeah, I know in my high school experiences, definitely these problems weren't talked about enough. And from other people my age who I talked about it, also it's never talked about. It's a really taboo topic that people are scared to give a platform to. So.
And yet it's so visible, actually. It is so visible. You know when someone's a cutter, or anorectic or bulimic. I mean, you know, they look near death's door.
Yeah.
You know, I have a friend's niece who's going through this, or great niece who's going through this at the moment. And this kid wants to drop out of therapy because she says it's too upsetting. And I said, oh my goodness, you know, get her into a peer group where people have come out the other door, really. But don't let the problem just continue like this. I mean, she's only 14. Very worrying. But I'm sort of disturbed that people didn't talk about it during your school days. Do you feel English kids are different? Do you feel they talk about it more, or do you feel it's pretty well, you know, across the board?
I think it's quite similar everywhere you go. I mean, there's always just, it depends on your friend group most. I think who you surround yourself with, how you feel comfortable, if you feel like you can talk about these issues. But overall, I don't think it's discussed enough. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's important. And that's why I think it's great that you're doing this now and may be seen by a lot of people, to set up discussions and to give people the freedom to talk about it.
Yeah. Kind of to bring up the mood, I know you knew
Sure.
Kate Millett and other feminists yourself, and I want to ask, what were your impressions of them, and how do you think, how strongly they contributed to the Me Too movement that is happening?
I think the Me Too movement is absolutely brilliant. Absolutely. The young woman, and she was a young African-American woman that introduced it. And we're all, I mean, I'm just bowled over by the global ripples, because there are now Me Too movements in Japan and Russia and all kinds of different places. And this is fabulous. Is there one in Lithuania?
I think there's a small subculture.
There is something, but it's certainly and it's been absolutely brilliant, and not only theoretically brilliant, but it has brought down some of the media moguls who've indulged in exploitation of young women for decades, like the Harvey Weinsteins and the Roger Ailes of CNN, and of course the spin-off movies about Roger Ailes like Bombshell. And this has been brilliant because very quickly it's got the message across, for people to be aware, youngsters to be aware of the exploitation, and to give them the courage to know they don't have to go through with it. We always had the expression in the past about the casting couch, and that this was all kind of young 19-year-old being terribly exploited, being made to feel that unless they obey or give in to these whims of these older disgusting guys, that they wouldn't get parts in plays or in Hollywood or even as news announcers. So I think what the Me Too movement has been such, and it's been huge. And then also you get the case now of these young Olympic gymnasts finally having the courage to come out and talk about a doctor who exploited them. And this was over years, and they did talk at the time, but nobody took them seriously, or nobody really believed what they were saying.
No,
And I think this is the most heartbreaking thing at Philly, that often people or individuals have spoken about. It's the group voice that gives clout, because often people talk individually and then they're scared, or they're told to shut up, or their careers and so on and so forth. But it's this group clout that has been the power.
So hi, and I wanted to ask if you can introduce yourself a little bit, just so people know your interests and what you do.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So my current project explores the negativity directed towards the immigrant community and questions if this community can rise above that negativity and thrive. Today I'll be interviewing Maya Goodfellow, which was someone that I acquired a lot of my research from, especially your book, Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats. Can you please give us a little introduction on yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Maya Goodfellow, as has been said. So I'm an academic at the University of Sheffield, and I sort of primarily work on issues around race, borders and migration. And yes, I've written a book, Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, which sort of gives a broad sort of history of Britain's immigration, like the history of immigration legislation and the history of immigration politics, and tries to sort of situate current hostility against a much broader historical context.
Great. Thank you so much. So I know that you did a lot of work in the migrant community, as you said, especially writing your book and writing articles for newspapers. What are your views on the people that belong to this community?
I think that's a good question. And I mean, the people that I've met through my work and just, that I meet through life, who've migrated to the UK, are really different, right? They're other people. And so they're sort of, whilst some of their experiences might be defined by their immigration status, in that they maybe can't access certain things like healthcare or housing, or they have to pay huge amounts of money to be in the UK, and there's a level of precarity that I think is very, very real for anyone who doesn't have citizenship. And obviously there's levels of precarity for people who do have citizenship as well. But actually people are people, and so they are human beings, not just their immigration status. And I think that's one of the things that people I interviewed for the book said, is that, I am so much more than just this story of how badly the immigration system in the UK has treated me.
Great. So yeah, you as you said, your book is very much about the hostile environment that was implemented in 2012. So in the book, you gave us a lot of historical situations of the hostile environment and what was happening around it. What are your views on how has and it still is harming the people within the community?
Yeah, so I guess there's two key things to say here. One is there's sort of a longer hostile environment, if you like. So the hostile environment of the title doesn't just refer to the hostile environment policies that were brought in through the coalition and Conservative governments through the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Act. It also sort of refers to this long history of hostility that is rooted in racism, that is rooted in different forms of exclusion, and that has seen people who had the right to come to the UK because they were living in colonies and former colonies, had that right taken away on the basis of race. So there's that broader history. But the second point is really the thinking about how the contemporary hostile environment builds on and deepens those forms of hostility. And we can see the effects of the sort of historic legislation and things like the so-called Windrush scandal. And if you think about who's excluded and how and why, from certain key things that people need to live, like the NHS, we can see that history of racism still shapes these forms of exclusion. But if we're going to look at now and think about the contemporary policies, what we see is that people are struggling to access, like I said before, essentially the necessary things, the very basic necessities that we all need to live. And so one example of this is during the pandemic, is that there's been several reports of people who are too scared or too worried to go to their local hospital or their local GP, even if they have coronavirus symptoms, because of their immigration status. They're worried that they will be charged. They're worried that they will, at some point, be deported. They're worried essentially they will be penalised in some way. And so that really shows us the very, very real effect of this sort of web of hostility that is embedded in a lot of British public services.
Yeah, I do agree with you. Through my research, I had a lot of stories like that. Who do you think should take responsibility for migrant justice, and who do you think should take the responsibility of saying, well, I created this, so now I should create a better environment for these people?
I mean, I think the responsibility in a lot of ways is sort of multi-layered. There's quite evidently the responsibility lies with politicians and policymakers, people who are implementing, devising, and sort of like coming up with these policies and like the history of these policies that they're building on. But I mean, we also look at the press, and we look at how the press sort of reproduces, like large parts of the press will reproduce some of these really negative narratives that sort of allow or help breed the kinds of anti-immigration sentiment that we've seen for a very long time. But I also think it's sort of incumbent upon everyone, right? Everyone within the UK, but also sort of globally, if we think about immigration regimes elsewhere and we think about the impact of borders globally, who's impacted and how, to say that we don't want other human beings to be treated like this just because they happen to be born in a different country and for all kinds of reasons maybe have moved here or wanted to move. We can see that governments know the impact, often know some of the impacts their policies are going to have, like the very negative, very, very, exposing people to destitution, to death. They often do know these things or then confronted with these things and sort of often carry on with their policies. But I think that it is the responsibility of everyone to sort of resist that and say that we want everyone to have a decent standard of living, no matter who they are or where they're from.
That's great. So in your book, you spoke about a lot about how Britain has this wrong idea that it has always been, and it is, a white country, and it was just disrupted by migration. What do you propose should be done to educate about migration, and why is it such an important step for society to take right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was educated in the UK state education system, like right up until, throughout all my studies, like right up until I was 18 in the state education system. And I really learned very, very little about Britain's sort of imperial colonial past. And so I think many others have advocated for this as well, including the Runnymede Trust, is that actually we should be learning about these histories and learning about these histories in a way that doesn't just sort of position Britain as this country like separated and off from the rest of the world, when actually there was so much resource extraction from the colonies. People were moving back and forth. Actually, many, many people from the UK and Europe were moving out to the colonies, and that is totally like erased in the history of like the telling of migration that we hear. And so I think, whilst I don't think putting that in as a statutory part of the national curriculum will necessarily change everything and do all the work that we need to be done, I think it is one sort of pillar, one way to try and begin to sort of shift how we understand Britain, how we understand movement, and how we understand sort of those colonial histories, if we understand them all.
Yeah. Can you give us some other examples of methods or actions that can be taken and should be taken to fight this negativity?
The negativity of like the histories, or like sort of contemporary, like
the sort of contemporary negativity that is directed towards this community right now, the hostile environment, the bigger part of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of groups that are doing like very, very important like resistance work. So you have, and it's like having some really significant important successes. You have things like Schools ABC, who were resisting the collection of children's data in schools. You have things like Docs Not Cops, which is a group that tries to sort of engage with healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, other people who are working in healthcare settings to explain like how to resist the hostile environment and not cooperate. You have organizations like JCWI who are sort of advocating for people's rights. So there are like loads, like there's almost like I don't know all of them because there are so many sort of locally rooted grassroots groups that are doing some really important work, like anti-raids groups as well, who are trying to halt policy or resist policy, but also some of these spaces are just trying to create a sort of alternative way of like engaging with one another. So it's not like one of the important things that I came across in doing the research for the book is like the groups that were saying this isn't charity, this is about solidarity and about working together to try and sort of create a different like a different way of doing things, if you like.
That's great. Yeah. What are your views on a no border discussion, not an implementation of the concept, but as a discussion that both nationals and migrants should take part in?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting literatures around no borders or open borders, depending on sort of like which like how you approach the subject and which you want to advocate for. And I think that it's very often sort of dismissed out of hand, as at least in the so-called mainstream, as being sort of like pie in the sky or ridiculous. And I think that it's important to have these conversations seriously and sort of begin to, and people, there are sort of people doing this kind of work, begin to say, what is the border doing, or what is bordering, acts of bordering, because it's not just like, you know, when you move through the airport, it's not just like when you get to the land that is sort of demarcated as Britain. Like these acts of bordering are going on internally, across countries. They are sort of all around us. What kind of violences are these acts of bordering doing? How are they impacting people? And what would a different way of organizing ourselves look like so that we weren't exposing often racialized groups to, or there's like sort of racialization embedded in the border process. We aren't exposing people to these forms of harm and creating these forms of harm. And so I think it's yeah, I'm sort of heartened by the no borders discussion, but also I guess there maybe needs to be a bit more like weighting down of some of it, of like what this would look like and how we can sort of imagine this alternative.
Yeah, that's great. My two last questions are you hopeful for the future of migration? Do you think we're in a positive path or on a negative path? And do you think that recent events have allowed us to see a future for this community to thrive, or do you think we're just going to have to keep surviving and just hope for the best?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, I'm not hopeful in that if you look at border policy, like things are already very bad and they're getting worse. You know, we're speaking like not even a week on from the people who crossing the channel who died trying to cross the channel. Like we can see the very, very real impacts of what these forms of bordering do and how they affect people. But I mean, I guess where there is hope is the forms of resistance that I mentioned, and the forms of resistance that people are continuing to engage in, like that aren't always visible, we don't always hear about like regularly, but that are going on. And so I think what I would say is that, you know, people do thrive. Like people still do thrive and carve out sort of lives for themselves amid all of this. But I suppose the real aim or the real desire should be for that to be something that people don't have to carve out, but that just is for people. And so it is about, and you know, I don't say this sort of trying to, I don't want to ignore the real forms of like real difficulty that people are in, but I think it is about saying that people should, you know, there's someone I interviewed for the book said to me, and I'll always remember this, is like we should be trying to create a world in which people have the right to stay and the right to leave and move if they want to. And so that is the world that we should be like looking to create. And I have some hope about that, but it does feel in many ways a long way off. But I think the important thing to focus on is the kinds of resistance that people are engaging in all the time, because that's where the hope for change sort of lies.
Great, that's amazing. Thank you so much for taking part of this interview. I think that's the time that we have. It was great talking to you. It was great knowing you. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Francesca, and this is Rob. Rob is a pathway leader for the Visual Communication Foundation course at the University for the Creative Arts in Canterbury, and he's also a graphic designer and an illustrator and a printmaker. And he was my tutor 3 years ago in 2018, 2019, when I did my foundation. I'm writing my dissertation at the moment on the role of art and design within education and also exploring education alternatives. And so I've decided to interview Rob because I thought he had an interesting approach to his educative, yeah. And coming from Europe, I think what I experienced at UCA was a lot more based on experience and going out and collecting information and drawing outside and everything. So it was very different and it was very dynamic. So how did this kind of come into place, this way that you have of teaching? Were you inspired by the way you were taught? Or did you just more like observe the students and see what worked best?
A little bit both. I think my own experiences, I studied at Camberwell, was quite a while ago. I think that really shaped me. Fundamentally, it was all about play, experimentation. This was quite a while ago, so education has quite changed, but I still think the fundamentals should be there of going and experiencing things, especially for visual communication orientated courses. Any arts-based course, you've got to be able to see things in order to make things or to change things, to understand the society that we're in, because you're making work for that society, about that society. So I think fundamentally going out and seeing things, creating visual literate students, people, artists is sort of fundamental. So getting out there with students, I think, is really, really essential. In order to develop your visual literacy, but also research skills. But I'm trying to think of another word for research, because a lot of people pigeonhole research, but it is. But that's really fundamental in any artist and designer, that you are going and seeing things, collecting things, in order to question things. So a lot of all of the projects that we based at UCA is based on primary research gathering, but then coming back with that material to then take that into an experiential practice through experimentation. Again, I think that is fundamental to any arts education, and I suppose I had that here. I did illustration degree. Well, actually, the program was slightly different then. The first year was like visual communication, and then the second year you specialised in illustration. But the same process was there in the first year, that we were sent out on locations to go and gather material and come back. So it was a little bit of both. So my own educational practice here has informed how I teach, but also we adapt things to the students' requirements and what students have definitely changed over like the last 20 years of how they see things, what they're interested in. Technology has totally changed that as well. You've got a lot more accessibility to gather secondary information. That's so easy now. But I still think fundamentally that you've got to be able to go and see things, to judge things. So I'm hoping that answers that. But
yeah, because essentially that's going to be your kind of creative process when you start working. No, if you're like used to going out and getting this kind of research when you're in education, then you're also going to apply that when you're working.
But you have to have material to judge against and to question. Surely that's the role of any artist and designer is to judge how is that made? Can I make that better? And you can only do that by observation, by seeing. And I think through observational drawing, even more so than maybe photography, that you really look and question.
And so with COVID and the online teaching that has been going on, how do you feel that this was adapted?
Tricky. So obviously workshops, so I'm a real advocate of play through workshops. So that was difficult. I think most tutors wanted to push that as far as they can. So I know a lot of people were doing like kitchen sink litho or making silk screens out of tights and things, trying to still have that element of play. So it took an awful lot to redevelop a course structure from the tutor's point of view, to adapt to that, to still try and have that philosophy of play. I think some institutions probably did it better than others. It also comes down to the students as well, how they can, what spaces they have to work in. So again, it was tricky to try and formulate a whole program that was going to suit everybody to work at home. Spaces, obviously, some people have lots of space, lots of facilities. Some have none. So, so that was quite difficult to try and create a sort of workshop space. Digital, that's okay. I don't know about here, but Adobe software was given to all students, so that was an easy transition to do digital workshops, but and I suppose tutorials and seminars they worked pretty well actually online. So there's different aspects of what can work well online. It was difficult though. It was a difficult period for everybody. I think most tutors probably became more of therapists. It took a lot of redesigning.
Of course.
Thousands of hours extra that the tutors had to put in.
And do you think it was beneficial in a way, this fact that you had to like kind of rethink over the structure that you already had in place?
Yeah, because it would make any tutor reevaluate, and that's a good thing. If you're caught up in teaching, it can be 100 miles an hour. I suppose that there was some sort of space there that we had to reevaluate, redevelop courses, and how we offer those. So I think that was a good thing that came out of it. And as I said, maybe for tutorials, sort of one-to-one tutorials, that might actually have worked better. But fundamentally, it comes back to what I really believe in is a studio practice, and that can't you can't replicate that. For two things, obviously about the space that I've just talked about for those individual students, that they need that. But I think an art school is about that practice, that you're in a space that you can share your ideas with your peers. That is essential. To me, that is what an art school is. It is that space that you're all there to openly play, experiment, make mistakes, share those mistakes, and that's where you're going to build a really inclusive learning environment that you're going to learn off each other. And online isn't going to do that.
Yeah, of course. And lastly, on a more kind of relevant level to UAL as well, we have been observing a lot of strikes and a lot of fund cuts and everything here, and in a lot of art unis as well. So do you want to talk about what is happening in the University of the Creative Arts?
Not necessarily just about where I work, but I think it's any institution, university now. It's fundamentally about making money. Whether that is at the expense of standards, that is down to those individual universities, institutions. The tutors are fighting every day to maintain standards. That's what they believe in. But the education system has totally changed over the last 20 years. It's an industry. They have to make money, but to some extent, the institutions have been taken over by administrators, accountants, to ensure that the institution makes money. Funding has been cut year upon year. Because I teach on foundation, the government have now cut that funding to 50%. Huge cut. So that's got a very detrimental effect on foundation courses. So there's all these external problems going on. A couple of years ago, there was a real dip in population in Britain for 16 to 18-year-olds. So there's a huge dip. Again, this is a competitive industry, which is horrible to say, but it is. So therefore, more onus on, overseas students, and also overseas students bring in more money. So there's lots of conflicts here that universities have to try and deal with. Where do they get the funding? How do they get the money? How do they safeguard standards? How do they safeguard that you have sufficient time, tutorial time, and space? So there's lots of things which are tutors have to deal with within this.
Yeah, it feels like they're kind of prioritizing more financial gain over the quality of teaching, because especially foundation was such a good course, and it really helped a lot of students realize what they wanted to do because they could explore so many options, and then getting rid of that really takes away a lot of opportunities for students.
Yes, totally. I'm a real advocate of foundation, and unfortunately, there are a lot of foundation courses which are being closed for really financial reasons, but that will also really affect the standard within British arts education. It will destroy it, basically.
Okay.
So what was a degree will now be really the level of a foundation. An MA will be the level of a degree. A PhD will be the level of an MA. Everything will decrease.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here and doing this interview.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, all right.
Okay.
Okay, so here we are with Femi. Femi, if you want to introduce yourself and let the people know what sort of things you do.
Hey, my name is Femi Videro. I'm from Peckham, Southeast London, and I write, I paint. I guess you'd say I'm predominantly a poet, right? So yeah, I make music. It's that simple, you know. I'm into human expression, and I channel my thoughts through the medium called music. That's exactly what I do.
We love that. Thank you for that. Okay, so a quick introduction into my subject of discussion today. Basically, I'm exploring the visual elements of music and where it is at the minute, where it's going to go in the future, and how should we treat it in order to make it the most effective it can possibly be. So, getting into the questions, Femi, I want to know what inspired you to make your album Critiques.
Oh, so as we all know, when COVID happened, yeah, for me it was like a space of reflection, you know, and it was like I've always been a writer in a sense. Like I remember when I used to take flights around Europe and do like my little weekend travels, I'd always like write in my iPhone, and I had a little notepad where I would like just jot down my thoughts, you know, like what I was feeling internally, like some form of journaling, you know. So that's something I've done for a long time, and I've always had like a deep interest in like music, hip hop, like poetry, like all types of music, just sound, you know. So when COVID hit and I really had time to, like, as we all did, to disconnect from the world in a sense, I just made the decision to like buy equipment, and through the assistance of like a friend called Henry, who I run with in a run group, who's a really good friend, he pushed me to like make music and just like threw stuff at the wall, you know, and here we are, like an album later, onto my second album. So yeah, just took like that courageous step to just create music and just to channel. And for me, it's therapy. That's what music is for me. It's nothing else. I'm not trying to make like bouncy tunes, or I'm just channeling my thoughts and my emotion. So that's why I think like I finally found a platform where I can utilize my words and bring life to story.
Yeah, so it's more kind of like your way of getting down those thoughts and feelings throughout your day, kind of like your journal before you go to bed.
Yeah, right. It's like a place where I can like revisit memories. I can like express how I'm feeling, like I've just mentioned, and and we can do all of this through like wordplay, right? So it's still very creative. I can build storylines and stories through my use of words. I'm an avid reader. I'm really into literature, so for me, it just makes sense to write. And yeah, I don't think I'm more creative than another person. I just think I have the courage to like find the things within me and just like jot them down and like make it happen. That's it. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you on that, especially with the lyrics on your tracks. It's very, I can tell it's very interpersonal.
Yeah.
It's very much like expressive of who you are as a person. You don't really hold back.
Yeah.
Through that form. So on to the next one. Like, what were the sort of visual thoughts you had when you were making this album? When you were there, kind of like playing with your equipment, writing down what you were saying. What were the things that were coming to your head visually?
But for me, like you just said, right, my music is super interpersonal. So for me, I've always been into like film photography, you know, so very warm. So visually, it was always gonna be like photos of me, you know, and there wasn't going to be any illustration or graphic design necessarily. It was always going to be like the real world, like my portrayal of the real world through photography. So I've always like loved film. I had a friend called Maria who like shoots on film, and I think the music I make and the imagery of like warm, vivid, like real life photography of myself in a particular situation, like it just matches. It connects the two elements, you know. So yeah, that's what I was thinking of when I was making the album. Was like, okay, like I had the concept in mind, exactly like what I wanted to portray through the images, and yeah, it was definitely like film, like photography, you know, and warm, that like rawness, you know, like having to go and like develop the film raw, and yeah, having that like specific looking imagery was super important to me.
Okay, interesting. I like that. That's a different way that I've ever thought of music, especially photography. So like in critiques, you kind of like use very very minimalist beats. You know, the music production is quite minimal,
Yeah.
and you in turn focus a lot on like the spoken word, and like the sustenance of what your lyrics are. So my question to you is, how do you feel that this impacts like the imagery of your work, and how your audience may like in turn imagine it for themselves? Because I know that like a lot of people will kind of listen to music and kind of focus on the actual sound elements and what they're hearing rather than the lyrics, and then back and forth as well.
Yeah, right. So as you say, I always try to have the beat, so the instrumental. Whenever I make music, I want it to like sit in the background predominantly. I want my voice to be the main focus, right? Because it's all about the story I'm telling, the emotion I'm trying to portray. And I think when one listens to like an album like Critiques or the songs I've just released, you're gonna hear my voice like front and center, you know. And at that point, I think people may like hearing such a voice as mine, right? And hearing these vivid stories I'm trying to tell, whether I'm telling them good or not, that's another question. But I think there's a link, or I can imagine that the audience is already thinking, okay, what does this guy look like? You know, like what does the album artwork look like? What is it gonna look like? You know, because it's so front and center. It's like I'm having a direct conversation with my audience. There's a real dialogue going on, you know, from my side. So I think that might like tempts the audience into like wondering, okay, like I really want to see what this album artwork is going to look like. And I'm guessing that they're probably thinking it's very much like photography based and like in your face, like vivid imagery, like very simple in a sense, because the music I'm making isn't surrounded in fireworks, you know, simple and plain.
Yeah.
I think that's like represented in the imagery.
Yeah. So speaking about like cover works and such, for Critiques, you put yourself in front of a brick wall, some nice like beige tones to it, and then you've got these petals kind of over your head and over your shoulders.
Yeah.
So would you consider that album artwork to like perfectly encapsulate the album in its entirety, or would you say there's still room for additional visual elements to kind of coincide with that cover art?
I think what we've done with the artwork, right? So if you look at the artwork, it's me against a brick wall, and I have like 3 flowers. So one on my left shoulder, one on my right shoulder, one on the top of my head, right? So
Yeah.
the word critiques is essentially, it comes from the Greek word to be critical with your art, right? So Critiques as an album for me is about looking internally and questioning everything that we've held as true up to this point, you know? So whether that be your ideology, the places you're from, the things you believe, the things you're taught by your parents, or the institution in which you went to school at. So the look within me, right? So my eyes are closed on my album artwork. So the look within me has like given birth to flowers, you know? So there's a whole story to it. Obviously, you won't know that unless you like sit with me now and I explain it. But it's like, once we begin to critique things that we hold as true and look within us, we can then give birth to new life, you know, in a sense. And those are the flowers that you see like on me, right? So I'm looking within me and I'm giving birth to new ideas, to this new ability to bring words together and portray my art. And yeah, that's it. Like the look within gives birth to flowers. That's how simple it is. So yeah, I've portrayed that on the album, and I guess it's like up for interpretation, etc. But that's like what I try to capture. Yeah.
Perfect. I love that. That's a nice little connection there between the title and the artwork, and I can appreciate the the connections you've made for yourself there. So when you do create your music, how do you visualize it? Do you have any like specific processes you kind of go through to help you like make the next beat or write the next line? Anything that's like visual based? Do you kind of like sit in the dark, say, and just close your eyes?
Yeah, I normally like candles at times, like burn incense. I like to like create a whole vibe when I'm making music, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, and I might like at times I have like these books, right, like that are just like paintings of like really, or like Matisse, like Picasso, or like African sculpture that I'll just like have open, you know, and I'll just like try and feed off that energy. Not at all times, but at times I have like tried, but it just happens to be like the situation in which I find myself when I'm writing, you know. So yeah, I love to set a vibe like in a very dim room in a sense, and yeah, for me it's really important to like visualize whilst writing. And I think what I'm looking at whilst I'm creating is like informing my next line, you know. And it's helping me build that story, and and not just like what am I seeing in like actual life, but what am I visualizing in my mind. That's also super important, you know.
Yeah.
Like at times I'm running through a story in my mind as I'm trying to build it through writing it down. So there's those two aspects. It's like the visualization in the mind and in person, you know, like what I'm actually seeing.
Yeah. So is it kind of like you kind of process the memories that you have and
Exactly,
think you
right?
store the kind of smells you could smell in those situations?
Might start to like play out a situation in my mind, you know, right in front of me as I'm like, if I'm facing writer's block, you know, like I have like a couple more lines I want to write, and I'm like looking at what I've written, and I'm also like imagining like the story in front of me, you know, and how would this play out, you know?
Yeah.
And how do I want to portray it? And how did I feel really? Like how did it make me feel, you know?
Yeah. I feel. So, is there anything that like dictates the visual direction for your album art, like color wise, composition wise, vibe wise? Because especially on your two newer singles, the vibe is quite similar in terms to Critique with the colors and like the vibe I kind of get from you and the way your body language dictates within the cover art.
Yeah. Yeah, what normally informs my album art is my music for sure, right? So what am I writing about? Like as you'll see with the new two singles, I have a project on the way called The Summer Art of Loving, and I've been really inspired by like old school architecture because right now I'm living in Barcelona, so I'm really inspired by like old school architecture. Like we've used the font called Sabon, which is a very particular like old, like it's an old school font, you know, it's a font you would find on like books back in the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, and for me this new project is very much like philosophical in a way, and it's about love and heartbreak and trauma and like the bare and laying human expression. So I think that's a nice way to portray it through that type of font. So yeah, normally what I'm making, the type of music I'm making informs the art.
Yeah, I can see on the cover art for An Attempt to Right My Wrongs is you can see the relationship with the architecture you have in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Got this nice cutout in a wall, and you are placed inside, and you can kind of already see the philosophical elements behind those visual choices there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So if you could like encapsulate your music with a color, what would it be?
Oof, that's a hard one, but if I have to pick a color, I would say like stony gray, if that's even a color, but like a gray, like a marble-ish gray, you know?
Yeah. What
That's
about
if I have to pick one color.
just one, like, and then what about an object, any sort of object?
Or an object.
Yeah.
What object would I say? That's a really tough one.
Even if you could
I'd say like a sculpture of some sort, you know, like the sculpture of like a Greek goddess, you know.
Okay, so like highly detailed sort of thing.
Highly detailed, like very simple. Hence why, like I say, like a sculpture, which is normally marble-ish gray, you know. It's like detailed. You know, like it is as you see it. There isn't much else happening away from the subject. It's about what you're.
Makes sense. Yeah.
It's about like the particular thing in what you're listening to or looking at. Yeah, so I'd say like that marble-ish gray and like a sculpture of a statue, right, of like a Greek goddess or something similar to that. Yeah.
That's interesting. I love that.
Yeah.
And then lastly, if you could create a music video for your newest single that you released just yesterday, My Once Rigid Heart, what would it kind of look like? Would it take like a narrative journey of you with the person you're referring to, or would it be something different, such as like a compilation of like landscapes that signify the thoughts and feelings that you have on that track?
Yeah, I think I'd like to play with both of those elements because the music videos I've shot, right? So I have one music video for a song called Algorithms off my first album, Critiques, and that's essentially a video of me just like rolling through my area of Peckham, Southeast London, and just like connecting with where I'm from and where I grew up from, like critiquing my area in a sense. And yeah, I think for My Once Rigid Heart, it would definitely be, because as you can see by the song, I'm like speaking about essentially a specific like individual. So yeah, it would follow a narrative, but also have elements of the landscape, you know. So maybe the sunset and the sunrise, maybe just me existing in different spaces. But yeah, it would definitely be paired with like a specific narrative, you know.
Yeah.
Which is related to the song, as you can hear.
Yeah, and you would try and perhaps like imagine those memories that you've got with this person, and almost you could like recreate them in a sense.
Exactly.
Or
Exactly that.
something along those lines.
Yeah. Or like as you're watching the music video and as you're hearing the lyrics, what you're seeing in the music video, you know.
Yeah.
The real story.
So you want them to match.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this song I would anyway, my one for sure, because
Yeah.
it's that type
Yeah,
of song.
I can tell it's a very personal one, and we've been going back to being vulnerable and allowing yourself to kind of be on the track and laid bare, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, that kind of like links back to your object of a Greek statue. You know, it's very much like this is what it is.
Yeah, this is what it is. Like no, there's no clothes on me. This is bare. This is my soul. You know, naked and vulnerable.
That's a good way. That's a good way to encapsulate that. Naked and vulnerable. Lovely. All right. Well, I believe that does it. So, for anyone listening out there, go stream Femi Badero. Critiques is an album he released this year, and his new album. Take it away, Femi. Tell them what it is.
The summer of loving. It should be dropping sometime next year, and yeah, we'll see when it comes out. But yeah, I have a couple singles out, so yeah, www.femibadero.com, @FemiBadero on Instagram, and yeah, stay connected and have a look at my music and maybe enjoy it. But yeah, more music on the way for sure.
Love that. Thank you very much, Femi.
Thank you very much, Ethan. I appreciate you, bro.
Love that. Back to you guys.
Hi guys. Are we live now? Yeah. Okay, cool.
We'll be back.
That's Colin. Beautiful production team and behind the scenes people.
Woo, give up day one.
Thanks to all of our guests for
Thanks for
joining
the
us.
guests.
Yeah, thank you to all the guests.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Bye guys.
Bye.